The tribes were beginning to join forces, something Marcus Aurelius learned full well during the Marcomannic Wars. As the 2nd century gave way to the 3rd century, this evolution of the Germanic tribes from disparate groups into larger confederations only sped up, and for most of the next century, as we saw ad nauseum in the last 15 episodes or so, the local legions stopped being a match for the invasion forces that now vastly outnumbered them. The legions and the provinces they protected were overrun, and only through immense effort and more than a little luck was the empire eventually able to turn the invaders back. For almost the entirety of the 3rd century, this shift in the balance of power forced the Romans to play catch-up, always 1, 2, or even 3 steps behind their enemies. A combination of improvised new strategies, think Gallienus's mobile cavalry, and sheer force of will, think Aurelian, allowed Rome to emerge intact into the late 3rd century. But it was clear that one of these days they were going to have to completely reassess their military posture. With the ascension of Diocletian, that day finally came. Not only did the new emperor possess the intellectual heft to conceive of something more than just another run of ad hoc responses, but when he came to power in the mid-280s AD, the empire had gotten just enough breathing space that it was open to change. In the north, the tribes of the Rhine and the Danube, and especially the Goths, who had been such a destructive force, had been beaten back by Diocletian's predecessors, and in the east, the Sassanids were temporarily weak and divided, following the death of Shapur. The time to act was now, and Diocletian did not miss his opportunity. So, what did he do? Broadly speaking, there are 4 things I want to talk about today. First, Diocletian's administrative redistricting that created a ring of small, militarized provinces around the edge of the empire. Second, the final separation of military and civilian career paths. Third, the division of the army into 2 distinct forces, the legions proper and a new static frontier militia. And finally, how these reforms interacted to create a web of varying depth surrounding the empire that would ensnare and then destroy an invading enemy. This is the so-called defense-in-depth theory proposed by Edward Lutwyck, and we will talk both about the model he proposed as well as the critiques other scholars have levied against it. Now, before we go on, I should note that all the usual caveats about a lack of good sources for all of this stuff still applies, and that as historians and scholars have cobbled together a picture of Diocletian's military, but they have been forced to centuries after the fact. It is, in short, difficult to separate out things that were specifically initiated by Diocletian from things that were merely attributed to him. Difficult to separate out things that were centrally planned from things that were initiated on the local level. And finally, difficult to weed out descriptions of his armies that are 100% free of anachronisms. That being said, the composition and posture of the legions did change during the period of the Tetrarchy, and the items I just outlined represent a fairly conservative estimation of the changes Diocletian undertook. Back in episode 89, Provincial Matters, we took a 45-minute-long tour of the empire that touched on each and every province in existence at the height of Rome's fame and fortune. That tour is now officially obsolete. In the mid-290s AD, most likely right as the Tetrarchy was being formed, Diocletian initiated a redistricting of the empire on a massive scale. At its most basic level, Diocletian waved his imperial wand and doubled the number of provinces overnight. We will deal more with the administrative implications of his redistricting next week, though, no, we will not be going on a tour of the now 100-odd Roman provinces. And for now, I want to focus solely on the military implications of the new boundary lines. Diocletian undertook the redrawing of the provincial lines for 2 main military reasons. First and foremost, by fracturing the size of the provinces, Diocletian hoped to cut down on the amount of power a single commander would wield. No more governor of Britain controlling 3 legions by himself, or the governor of Lower Germany personally commanding 3 or 4 of his own. Smaller provinces meant a local commander would usually have at his disposal what amounted to a single legion. This hopefully meant less threat of revolt. The second reason the provinces were fractured is that Diocletian wanted to divide up the dangerous and perpetually besieged outer rim of the empire from the softer and more prosperous inner territories. The former would become essentially military districts, while the latter would be allowed to go back to being simply provinces, or, more accurately, undistracted economic engines for the empire. In essence, Diocletian wanted the ministers in charge of the outer provinces to focus on defense, and the ministers of the inner provinces to focus on the economy. These two factors had to work in tandem for the empire to thrive, and the emperor no longer wanted economic concerns to go unaddressed because the governor was off fighting the Alemanni, and he didn't want the frontier lines to be neglected because the governor of Pannonia was stuck dealing with a grain distribution issue. Related to the division of the empire into what amounted to military and civilian districts was the final severing of military and civilian career paths. This was not a novel idea by any means, but Diocletian brought it to its logical conclusion. Since the reign of Gallienus, the Senate had been denied military postings, which meant, in practice, that key provincial governorships were now handed over to military men, rather than rich aristocrats, as had been the previous custom. But this was not enough for Diocletian. In his mind, it was just as bad for career soldiers to be running administrative offices as it was for untrained senators to be leading armies. It was an inefficient misallocation of talent, and he aimed to put a stop to it. So, flying in the face of the whole of Roman history, Diocletian decreed that the political governor of a province and its chief military officer would no longer be the same man. He did this for the same basic reason he divided up the provinces. First, the checks and balances created by the separation of military and political power would undercut potential rebellion. And second, it would allow each leader to focus on his appointed tasks without being suddenly called off to deal with a foreign invasion or a new tax law. Of course, political and military power could never be divorced from one another at the highest level. But from here on out, on the provincial level, a general, now called a dux, the precursor of the medieval duke, was not in charge of tax collection, and the governor was not in charge of any troops. Together with the creation of the militarized Outer Rim provinces, the split of defense concerns from political or economic concerns meant that the army would no longer be distracted in any way from their all-important task of keeping the empire safe from attack. The question then is, what did Diocletian's army look like, and how did it differ from the army he inherited? Well, we've already seen that right off the bat he was troubled by the concentration of force around the emperor, and how that left huge swaths of the empire open to attack. That was the main catalyst behind his initial decision to elevate Maximian, and it played a huge part in his further decision to create the Tetrarchy. A sole emperor running around trying to plug every leak in the empire was as dangerous as it was impractical. No matter how fast it could move, it would never be fast enough. So right away, we see the armies return to something resembling their pre-crisis years deployments. Only now, each section of the empire was not commanded by a potential usurper, but a fully initiated member of the Imperial Brotherhood. But wait a second, didn't that old system completely break down in the face of immense new pressures? Why, yes it did. But we should not forget that a big reason why it broke down was that usurpers kept leaving the frontiers undefended as they made their bids for power back in Italy. The establishment of the Tetrarchy was supposed to negate that possibility, and at least while Diocletian reigned, that's exactly how it worked. But of course, Usurpers abandoning their post was not the whole story, and Diocletian knew it. The other big problem spread the Roman forces out enough to effectively monitor the frontier, nor concentrated enough force in one area for them to overwhelm their new, larger opponents. In other words, the 4,800 to 6,000 man Roman legion, which had been in existence for 800-odd years, was now becoming obsolete. Previous emperors had, of course, realized this already. Gallienus's creation of the mobile cavalry is an obvious result of this understanding. But Diocletian's reformed legionary formations would actually flow from a different tradition. For years, cohorts of soldiers, usually labeled vexellations, would be peeled off from their parent legion and deployed elsewhere to shore up some undermanned area or lend a hand in some difficult situation. Sometimes the vexellations would return home when their specific task was complete, but often they simply never returned to their parent legion at all. In many theaters, these vexellations, usually numbering between 500 and 1,000 men, began to be regarded as the de facto unit of deployment. Smaller and faster than a standard legion, they could be bunched together when a concentration of forces was needed, and kept spread apart when the danger had passed and frontier-wide surveillance was needed. Diocletian knew all about how these vexillation units functioned, and how much flexibility they gave commanders, and when he took power, he aimed to make their status official. That did not mean that the old legions were simply scrapped, and indeed most of the existing legions kept right on functioning as they always had. But it did mean that when Diocletian created new legions, as the circumstances of his times demanded that he do, they were not the traditional size. Diocletian's legions were instead a complement of just 1,000 men, which helps explain how he was able to add 30 new legions to the roll over the course of his reign, which would be a staggering number if you fail to account for their reduced size. These new legions were stationed across the empire at strategic points, far enough apart that they could watch a wide swath of territory, while simultaneously being close enough to one another that if a major invasion broke across the frontier, they could quickly join together and fend off the attack. We'll get into a deeper discussion of that in a minute. The other real innovation that Diocletian introduced into the army is a little bit trickier to nail down, because it involves the possible insertion of anachronisms into the historical record. The traditional account is that it is at this point that the legions were joined on the frontiers by a less well-trained, less well-paid, quasi-militia called, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, the Limitanii. These troops, drawn from the local population, would be part-time soldiers and part-time farmers. And thus, in addition to helping defend the empire, they would also help keep the heavily garrisoned frontier provinces at least somewhat self-sufficient. Their mission was twofold. First, to police the frontier lines and defend against small-time brigands, and second, to act as a warning bell for the rest of the army if something bigger was on the way. No one expected the Limitanii to stop anything of substance coming across the border, but they were expected to raise the alarm and hold key fortifications until help arrived. The problem with all of this is that though Diocletian usually gets credit for introducing the Limitanii into the system, these militiamen